He's the executive director of the Silicon Valley innovation salon, Futurecast, the host of the popular internet chat show, Keen On, a senior fellow at Cal Innovates, a columnist for CNN, and much acclaimed public speaker around the world. In 2015, he was named by GQ magazine in their list of 100 most connected men. Mr. Keen is going to be joining us on stage to talk about repairing a broken world. Time to fix the future. Ladies and gentlemen, in the present, let's talk about the future. Thanks to Mr. Keen. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
Why are you like Ricky Gervais? What is in that glass?
Diet Coke.
Oh, okay, fine.
I can't survive without Diet Coke. Well, thank you. Well, it's nice to be here. So I just have a new book out called How to Fix the Future, which assumes, of course, that the future is broken. The future, of course, is always broken. There's always things to fix. That's the nature of us as human beings. We began this session with a robot. Robots don't know how to break things because they don't know how to create things. The strength of human beings is they are incredibly creative, but in our creativity, in our ambition, we are also capable of breaking things. So my presentation today is about fixing the future. That's a big subject, of course, fixing the future. Yesterday, I heard Paul Polman speaking also about fixing the future. Polman argued that there are two big problems with the world today, two big problems that need to be fixed. I'm not sure that he's wrong. I'm going to add a third. What Polman argued is that the first great issue confronting humanity today is economic equality, is the growing gulf between a tiny group of incredibly rich people, the multi-billionaires, the 1% or the 0.1%, and the rest of humanity. Polman also argued that the second crisis facing humanity is a kind of legacy of the Industrial Revolution. It's the consequence of global warming. It's the environmental catastrophe which many people believe we're on the brink of. I think he's right on both fronts, but my focus is on the third issue, the third challenge, the third potential catastrophe facing mankind, and that is the digital revolution. Now, let me make it really clear. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technology. Like everybody else, I'm wired. I'm from Silicon Valley. My background is as a tech entrepreneur. So I think when one warns about the dangers of technology, when one speaks about this third specter confronting mankind, we have to acknowledge that one can be concerned without being against technology. I'm not in the business of smashing machines, and I'm not in the business of writing books about smashing machines or encouraging my readers or my audience to smash machines. Smashing machines makes no sense in today's digital world. Having said that, though, I am more and more convinced, every day makes me more convinced, that the digital revolution is at the moment failing. It's not failing because of its technological accomplishments. We saw all afternoon the achievements of AI. We've seen the consequences of Gordon Moore's law, the doubling of computer chip strength every 18 months, which has resulted in human-like, and I use that word carefully, human-like creatures sitting on this stage and engaging in conversations with actual humans. In 10 or 20 or 30 years, no doubt those conversations will become more real, more convincing, more human. What I'm suggesting, though, is that in spite of all that technological achievement, the great issues confronting mankind are in many ways rather similar to the issues confronting mankind in the middle of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, as a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. Unemployment, inequality, injustice, cultural decay. Now, as I said, my background is as a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. I was very fortunate to be in San Francisco in the middle of the 1990s. I was slightly itinerant. I was a music journalist. In other words, I didn't really have a career. And like so many other people who happened to be in San Francisco in the middle of the 1990s, I became a startup entrepreneur. I founded a company called Audio Cafe, and over the last 30 years, I've been an entrepreneur and a commentator, a kind of personality in the digital stage, both in Silicon Valley and around the world. Now, back in the 90s, of course, I founded my company because, like every other entrepreneur, I wanted to be rich and famous, preferably rich. Now I'm just famous and poor. But there were other reasons, more profound, more humanistic reasons for my excitement of the digital revolution, for my willingness to throw myself into this great transformation. Well, it began in Silicon Valley, and particularly in San Francisco in the 90s, with the foundation of the commercial internet. I thought that the internet would enable cultural freedom. I thought that it would trigger more and more understanding as everyone around the world found themselves on the same electronic network. I thought we would see more sympathy, more cultural sophistication, more profound, sympathetic conversation. I also thought that the internet would be an engine of economic growth, that it would create opportunities for everybody, that the digital revolution would trigger a kind of democratic explosion of innovation, that it would generate wave after wave of opportunity for entrepreneurs. You didn't have to be an entrepreneur, I thought, in the 1990s to engage in the digital revolution. I assumed it would create remarkable new opportunities, not just for entrepreneurs, but in terms of jobs. Work would be transformed. Digital would make more employment opportunities. And above all else, I thought that digital would ennoble us as human beings. It would create freedom. It would deepen our sense of liberty. It would enrich democracy. I thought that it was the greatest thing that could happen to humanity. That was, of course, back in the 1990s, 1995, before Facebook, before Google. Imagine a world before Google, just as Amazon was getting going. This was a world before AI became a reality. Everyone always understood AI as a kind of dream. As we've seen in this conference, increasingly it's becoming a reality. Now, I've suggested that digital represents the third great crisis of our civilization. Why? What's happened over the last 25 or 30 years to convince me of this? Some of the stuff, of course, is self-evident. We've seen with AI in terms of jobs that the next generation of technological innovation is going to essentially replace us. We have robots doing more and more, not only of the menial task that we've historically been engaged in, but increasingly sophisticated tasks. Over the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, lawyers and doctors and engineers are all going to be replaced by smart algorithms. Their expertise, the very thing that they studied for at university and school and immersed themselves in textbooks, those things, as we've learned this afternoon from AI experts, can be replicated almost instantly by bots, by algorithms, all algorithms, of course, are smart, by algorithms that teach themselves, perhaps even teach themselves consciousness. Jobs, as many economists are now realizing, are about to be decimated by the AI revolution. A couple of very prominent Oxford University professors of economics wrote a white paper a few years ago. They suggested that 47% of conventional work would be replaced over the next 10 or 15 years. Now, I don't know how they came up with 47%. Maybe it's 48, maybe it's 46, maybe it's 38, but even if it's 20%, imagine that. Whole professions being swept away by the digital revolution. We were told that there would be more economic opportunity, a democratization of the economic world. Well, of course, what we have, which wasn't obvious in the middle of the 1990s, is a winner-take-all economy. You see that in India, you particularly see it in China, and you see it in Silicon Valley, with the dominance of the 5 largest companies, of Amazon, of Microsoft, particularly of Google and Facebook and Apple. Collectively, these are the 5 wealthiest, most highly capitalized companies in the world, and their wealth is compounding the inequality, the thing that Paul Polman warned us about in his presentation. The 8 wealthiest multi-billionaires in Silicon Valley and worth something like 20% of the wealth of the rest of humanity. Inequality is rife. You see it in San Francisco. Some of you may have been there. San Francisco is increasingly a feudal city, a city of mass unemployment. It's a city of shit. The homeless use the streets as bathrooms because the breakdown of public services has meant that increasingly the middle class has disappeared from the city and the rich are protecting themselves in their fortresses and the poor are living on the streets. Economics, jobs, inequality. Well, what about freedom? Sure, we can all use these machines to express ourselves. But what is the real result of the digital revolution? There's a phrase that's acquiring a great deal of vogue today because of a new book called surveillance capitalism. But what Silicon Valley has invented and is now being perfected in other countries, particularly in China, is surveillance capitalism. We were told by the great platforms that they would liberate us. Google told us that we would have free information at our fingertips. Facebook gave us free platforms to create social networks and engage with people all over the world. Now, I couldn't live without Google. I do live without Facebook. But most of us are dependent on these products. The problem, of course, is their economic model. We don't pay for these things, or at least we don't pay formally. This is the so-called free economy. We use Google and Facebook and Twitter for free, and their business model, their incredibly lucrative business model, is acquiring our data, knowing more and more about us, undermining our essential individuality, and selling those data back to advertisers. Your industry has been blemished, corrupted by this new digital economy. When I wrote my first book in 2007 called Cult of the Amateur, I was one of the first people to actually say, hold on a minute, this doesn't work. Advertising is undermining our liberty. Advertising is taking away our freedom. Advertising is just a new, sophisticated form of digital tracking. And I thought that the advertising industry would actually dislike this because that's your bread and butter. But actually, one of the first people to write to me after I had my book published was Martin Sorrell. You saw him yesterday. Now he's become a friend of mine, the former CEO of WPP, formerly the most powerful man in the world when it came to advertising. Sorrell understood it immediately. Advertising couldn't carry media. These are media companies hiding behind this charade of free content. Surveillance capitalism then takes away our individuality. It turns us into products. In a commercial sense, it may not be Orwell, it may not be Big Brother, but as we heard yesterday from Alibaba, the way in which this technology and this new data surveillance is being used in China crosses over also into the political sphere. The Alibaba guy didn't say it, but it was pretty obvious from his presentation. This is incredibly chilling. When Orwell wrote 1984 in 1948, he could never have imagined the kind of surveillance that now exists in our world. He could never, in 1984, there were these kind of rusty cameras in people's bedrooms and in their living rooms. Today, with these chips, we carry these cameras around. We are watching and we are being watched all the time, ubiquitously, particularly now in the so-called Internet of Things. Freedom, then, is being undermined. Our traditional notion of liberty, of being able to escape the gaze of the state, of commercial interests, of being isolated, of being free. And of course, as sociologists and psychologists have realized over the last few years, these devices are addictive. They're particularly addictive to young people. And the wizards, the software wizards, the programmers in Silicon Valley have designed their products explicitly so that they are addictive. These are, and I happen to have a fizzy drink in one hand and a smartphone in the other, but they're basically the same thing. I'm doubly addicted, of course. What about culture, then? For all the surveillance, for all the inequality, for the looming crisis of unemployment, at least we can all talk to one another on the internet. At least we can share our opinions. At least we can learn from one another. But of course, that really isn't true either. Sure, we can go on networks with people from Korea or India or Turkey or Norway. Men and women can talk. Muslims and Hindus can talk. Jews and Muslims can talk. People for or against Brexit can talk. People for and against Donald Trump can talk. But they aren't, because this media is an echo chamber. It's fragmenting the mainstream media. There's a guy in the audience, I don't know if he's here, I've seen him around in the hotel. He's got this T-shirt that says, "Distrust mainstream media." Are you here? He's so distrustful, he's probably not here. We assumed that when we got rid of mainstream media, when we could all become publishers, when we could all put our content out on Facebook, when we kind of collectivized our wisdom and put it on Google, that we would free ourselves. But of course, that's not true. What we've created is a media of narcissism. The social media platforms like Facebook are themselves, by definition, narcissistic. They are driving us into ourselves. They are isolating. It's no coincidence, then, that young people who have grown up with this media are increasingly lonely. Sociologists tell us that the younger generation is much, much lonelier than any previous generation. These devices drive us into ourselves. We don't talk on them. Facebook is the antisocial network. It's a network of narcissists. And of course, it's no surprise that America now has the first narcissist president, a man so deeply in love with himself that he's incapable of any kind of conversation. He's less able to converse than the electronic lady who started this thing, which is quite an achievement. Okay, so I hope I've made you miserable. You're all in tech. You're all thinking to yourself, well, yeah, this is kind of true, but what can we do about it? These forces are so large. These companies, these trillion-dollar companies, these inevitable forces, this Moore's law, which seems to change everything overnight. What can we do about it? We just have to kind of, I can say this in India, we just have to lie back and think of England or India or whatever you do when you lie back. But of course, that's the fundamental error. As Pullman said, we have a fundamental challenge in our world of making the world a better place. And this is the great challenge of our age. And digital is particularly relevant because we've replicated technology to be like ourselves. We have these robots on stage. We have these algorithms that are replacing us. So that there's a double challenge, a double existential challenge to what we are faced with. We need to establish ourselves in this world. The technology is moving so fast that to many of us, we don't seem to be able to catch up. The technology is moving so fast that it makes us feel disempowered. It makes us feel footnotes. It makes us feel irrelevant. So that's the great challenge of our age. That's the meta challenge, is establishing agency. I make agency the key word in my book, How to Fix the Future. Agency is the thing that defines human beings. That robot that appeared on stage, it didn't have any agency. It couldn't think for itself. It couldn't be creative. As it even acknowledged, it can't converse. For all we know, that whole conversation may have been canned. But as the AI guy said, the one thing that technology can't do, or AI can't do at the moment, is converse, is have conversation, because it requires the very kind of agency which machines don't have. Now, in my book, I come up with another version of Moore's Law. You've heard this Gordon Moore's Law all day today throughout the conference, this law that is the motor of the digital revolution. But my Moore's Law is not from Gordon Moore, the co-founder of Intel, who came up with his observation in 1965. My Moore's Law is derived from Sir Thomas More, a 16th century Englishman who wrote a book called Utopia. Some of you may have read it. If you haven't, you should. One of the most important books ever read. More's Utopia is not utopian. It's a reminder more than anything else, and he was writing at the beginning of the 16th century at a time of equal disruption, of existential angst, of uncertainty. He was reminding us of our power. What makes us human is our ability to shape our world. What makes us human is our ability to fix the future. So agency is key. Moore's Law, then, my Moore's Law, is the very thing that we need to establish. There's nothing inevitable about Moore's Law. It comes out of our will, our ability to have agency. It comes out of our determination to make the world a better place. It comes out of our need, an existential need to confront these huge problems of inequality, of potential unemployment, of cultural decay, of surveillance capitalism. So what do we do? How do we fix the future? Agency, then, is the meta theme. It's the thing that exists above everything else. We can all determine agency, both in large and small forms, as parents, as teachers, as entrepreneurs, as voters, as politicians, as executives, as technologists. There is no killer app to fix the future, no simple solution. It's going to take a long time, just as the Industrial Revolution has taken 200 years to work out many of its most disruptive kinks. And of course, with global warming, we know that there are still many problems outstanding. In my book, I lay out 5 pillars, 5 strategies that we need to focus on. For the first 30 years of the digital revolution, it's really been run from Silicon Valley, from free market principles. It's the idea that nobody needs to intervene, that the market knows best. And I think over the last 35 years, with this winner-take-all economy, with the increasing gulf between the wealthy and the poor, with the imminent crisis of unemployment, with the and Pullman talked about this, with the fundamental irresponsibility of Silicon Valley companies to live up, not to their corporate, but to their civic responsibilities, that period has ended. We need more regulation. Regulation is one theme. In my book, I talk about the Europeans who are making these companies accountable, forcing them to pay their taxes, making them accountable for the garbage that's published on their platforms, forcing antitrust investigations of these winner-take-all companies that are actually crushing real innovation in the economy. You Indians have done a great job. The net neutrality fight you had with Facebook was critical. Facebook essentially misled Indians, particularly poor Indians, into suggesting that they could have free internet access if they used the Facebook product. But of course, what Facebook was actually providing with the so-called internet was Facebook. On this free service, you couldn't even access Google. The Indian government made that illegal. Government matters. It mattered in the 19th century in making child labor illegal, in fighting environmental laws, in making sure that the products weren't addictive and exploitative. So regulation is one theme, but it won't work on its own. It's often a very controversial theme, and after many of my speeches, people always come up to me and say, oh, you can't just do it with regulation. You sound like the old Soviets, or like the old Labour government, or the old socialist government in India. But I'm not saying that. I'm saying that regulation is important, but it goes with the other four themes. The other theme, the second theme, is innovation. We need entrepreneurs creating responsible products, new business models that don't exploit, that don't mine our personal data, but nonetheless create valuable products. Look, I love Google. And I'm actually going to speak at Google next week because they recognize the problem. What I would like Google to do is charge for their product and guarantee that they don't mine my data, that they don't take away my individuality, that they don't know what I'm going to do before I know it myself. We need their new thinking from entrepreneurs, whether it's in India or China. China is another question because of the nature of the government, or the US. I'm increasingly beginning to feel, particularly the more time I spend in India, that real innovation will come in a market like this. The Europeans are very good at regulation, they're less good at innovation. The Chinese are very good at innovation, but of course they have a surveillant authoritarianism that's deeply troubling in political terms. India then may indeed be the future when it comes to innovation, particularly given the vibrancy of your culture, the openness, and the opportunities here given your domestic market. Consumers matter too. Consumers have to fight back. It's not enough for consumers, just as they did in the Industrial Revolution, to eat addictive products or drive cars that were death traps. Consumers are now pushing back on these products. Consumers are demanding more, and that is essential. It's not enough for consumers to simply not read the terms of service and claim ignorance when they use these products and increasingly becomes clear that they're being exploited, that their privacy is being decimated by these surveillance companies. Consumers have to step forward, and they're beginning to. I'm less familiar with what's happening in India, but certainly in Europe and the US, you have a delete Facebook movement. You have more and more consumers becoming aware through work like mine and more authors that these products are dangerous. The model I use is Ralph Nader. In the 1950s, the American car industry was dominant. It was globally dominant. There was barely a Japanese or a German car industry. And then this lawyer, this gadfly, this consumer activist, Ralph Nader, in 1965, just the same year that Moore wrote put his Moore's Law thing together, Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed that exposed the fact that American cars were death traps. This essentially undermined the American car industry and resulted in increasing strength of the Japanese and the German industries that focused on consumer safety. So consumers matter. Citizens, of course, matter. In my book, I went around the world. I went to Estonia. I came to India. And I very much like, in some ways, what your data people are doing here. I went to the east and west coast of America. I spent a lot of time in Europe. And I'm seeing more and more citizens beginning to stand up for workers, for making this world, manifesting Moore's Law. So, for example, in Boston, I met a woman, a lawyer, who's working for Uber drivers to make sure that they have rights. Because just as social media isn't very social, the sharing economy isn't very sharing. The Uber executives have become multi-billionaires, but Uber drivers are mostly working for less than minimum wage, and they have no rights. So we have lawyers now working on behalf of Uber drivers. We have a new kind of civic responsibility. And finally, the final pillar, which I think is really the most important, but it's also the most challenging and nebulous and long-term, is education. You've seen in this conference that we're on the brink of a fundamental change in the very nature of civilization. We've invented machines that replicate us, that can talk to us, that can be wheeled on stage. We have these algorithms that may indeed even acquire their own consciousness. So what's our role in this world as human beings? Where do humans stand? How are we going to make a name for ourselves? How are we going to represent ourselves? How are we going to make sure that we don't become enslaved by these self-conscious algorithms? The real change, the fundamental challenge, lies in education. The old education system was a top-down industrial education system that was essentially teaching us to become like computers. That was important in the industrial age because we needed smart mechanical creatures to operate the industrial system. We needed accountants and lawyers. We needed people to be able to add things up and read textbooks and learn from knowledge and build a kind of information world. We're on the brink of a new world where we don't need these people. So what are we going to do? How do we prepare our children for this brave new world? Is there hope? It has to come out of education. Because there is a chink in the digital armor. There is a chink in the armor of that creature who was wheeled on stage at the beginning of this session. That chink is they can't make speeches like this. They can't be creative. They can't really talk to one another. They can't be empathetic. They can't look you in the eye and tell you you're sick. That is what we need to train our children for. And in the final chapter in my book, I focus on education. New education systems built on revolutionary ideas from Montessori or Waldorf, early 20th century educational principles that bring out, that train, that nurture the creativity in human beings. It's no coincidence, although it's rather sad, that these schools are particularly doing well in Silicon Valley, because Steve Jobs never let his kids carry around these devices in their home, and most Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and executives and technologists understand this world that they're creating. They know they have to train their children differently. So the most popular, the most difficult Waldorf schools to get into, Waldorf education is one that doesn't allow 6 and 7 and 8-year-olds any kinds of screens in school. The most popular Waldorf schools are in Palo Alto and in Mountain View and in Menlo Park. And the kids there, their parents are tech executives. They are training their children for this new world. There will, I hope, be jobs. I'm cautiously optimistic. But it only comes through agency. As I said, it won't come naturally. There's nothing inevitable about it. We need to roll up our sleeves collectively. We did it in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution. Not altogether successfully, but in some ways, this is our greatest challenge now. Perhaps our greatest challenge in the history of our species. Some pessimists like Harari believe we're at the end of our history as a species. I'm more optimistic, but it'll take a great deal of work, and I think in particular in a country like India, which has the kind of vitality and optimism and size, what Silicon Valley would call scale, that the Europeans are missing, I'm more and more optimistic that the real solutions to fixing the future will begin here. Thank you.
Well, there were many moments when, you kept saying, that chick, she can't look you in the eye and say you are sick. Or she can't speak without data being fed inside her brain. And I go like, how rude, how does he know?
Did she look you in the eye?
No, I'm talking about myself. I thought you were talking about me.
Didn't you feel weird talking to her?
Huh?
Didn't you feel weird talking to her?
That's going to be a conversation we're going to have at the keynote.
Privately, right?
Yeah,
offline.
No, but really, so there were a few things that I wasn't prepared for as well. And there was a time when we were talking and, she didn't respond back to me. So I looked at Brian and I said, Brian, she isn't speaking back. So he said, I've muted her. I was like, wow. And then I was like, are we doing this or not? And then he unmuted her, and little did I know she's going to reply back What do you think I'm waiting for? She blew my mind.
Especially when you asked her if you were her friend.
What?
No, you asked her if she was your friend.
Yeah.
Could you ever be friends with a computer?
I could be friends with you, yeah, but I don't know about a computer.
I'm not a computer.
Actually, I'm terrible with computers, so no, I'm actually scared of them in general. But thank you so much for... What is in your drink?
So I finished it. It's
Okay,
Coke.
good job.
Diet Coke.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite on stage Mr. Vikram Sakhuja to present Mr. Keane with a memento of gratitude. Please put your hands together for the man who talks about nothing but emotional reality. Thank you. There needs to be a lot of emotion to create artificial intelligence as well, right? Thanks, Mr. Sakhuja, for joining us. Thank you. Would you be friends with a robot?
Oh, good. Thank you very much.
Mr.
It's
Keane?
hot out here.